Good morning, all. Keisha, are we at quorum?
We need one more for quorum. We're at quorum, Sharita.
Good morning, all.
Thank you very much, Keisha. Good morning, everyone. We'll call our meeting officially to order at 10:31 a.m. As much as I try to not get my daughter's appointment not scheduled at a conflicting time for this meeting, even if I try to get here early, it still doesn't work out. So at some point during our session, I may have to drop out for a few minutes. But Colin will pick up wherever I left off, and then I'll rejoin as soon as I can get to a location where I can talk. Because there are parts over here that are blind spots, so where the phone just doesn't work. So I just wanted to make everyone aware of that. Happy New Year. We've completed our welcome, and the next item on our agenda is the approval of our minutes. I will entertain a motion to approve our minutes.
And that would be the December 9th minutes.
That is correct.
I move to approve. This is Helen.
I have a motion. Do I get a second?
I'll second that.
All right. All those in favor? No questions. Our minutes approved. All right. The next item on our agenda are the unsheltered numbers update, and I'm not at my desk for the morning yet, so I actually haven't seen them. Colin or is Nicole Lamb here? Nicole here today?
I don't see Nicole. I don't have those numbers yet,
Okay.
Madam
So
Chair.
maybe-
I'm sure they'll be coming shortly. I just emailed to see if we have an update.
All right. Well, we will move along. So the next item on our agenda is our pre-shelter committee update. And I have Drew here listed to lead that conversation. Drew, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sharita. And just to clarify, because I have so many documents in front of me, this is a pre-shelter update, and then I'm also going to give an update, which is similar but also not, about our ad hoc alternative shelter group, if that's okay, because I'll start with that.
Hey, Drew,
So-
you sound like
okay.
you're a little bit underwater.
Okay, 1 second.
So Drew, I do have a question. So I was under the impression that the ad hoc group became the pre-shelter group. Is that not correct? Or are these two separate entities? Just for
They're separate.
future reference.
I just want to articulate that, if that's okay.
Okay. Good to know.
Okay. So I just want to give a quick update about the ad hoc working group that was a subcommittee through the Policy and Planning Committee. Colin, can you hear me okay now? Sorry. Okay,
Yes,
great.
we can hear you.
5 years into COVID and I still have technology issues through Zoom. So as a reminder about how that came to fruition, there was some conversation about safe parking and wanting to explore alternative shelter options that was outside of a congregate setting. So starting in about October of last year, Ryan and I began co-chairing this working group that met twice to explore alternative solutions outside of just normal congregate settings. Like I said, we met twice. The charge of that group was to just start that conversation and to see what would be reasonable solutions for our community. Kind of the consensus we came to after a couple of working sessions was mainly looking at safe sleeping, safe parking, and then pallets, and what populations that would be reasonable for, whether that was singles, folks with chronic and persistent mental illness, or for families with children. And so we worked on a number of solutions, came up with some proposals and started working on some of those things. And then as co-chairs of that group, we realized that there was so many meetings going on and that we were not going to duplicate services. And so we paused that ad hoc working group, and that was kind of where we left, and we have not met after those 2 meetings. So does anyone have questions about that ad hoc working group or that ad hoc committee? So the pre-shelter group is a part of the city county school task force that Councilmember Javiero and Commissioner Wendy Jacobs, among others, had started. And there was a working group for pre-shelter that had been meeting, and there was some momentum to bring up a number of things, and that included different alternative options to congregate shelter. So folks in that group, it seemed like they were ready for putting in a mid-year proposal. And so that included different immediate funding options that would go forth to managers and elected officials by the end of this week. That came up in the last HSAC meeting. And what was really elevated was options around safe sleeping. So that would include sanctioned encampment. That would include pallets for families with children, and then pallets. That would be another site for folks with high needs. That would be folks with chronic and persistent mental illness. And I'm happy to let Brian chime in as well if you have any updates that you would like to share.
I think you touched on the high point. I just will re-stress what we were hearing, because there was significant overlap in both of those groups, was being efficient with, you know, all the different leaders and organizations who were involved. And so that work, some of that work that was around non-congregate shelter, moving into the space where many of us were also already meeting. And so those conversations, I would say that the work of the pre-housing shelter subcommittee of the task force is looking at additional items beyond non-congregate shelter. All the things that it are looking at are the things that have been kind of, and I think this is a very anyone else in the conversation can clarify, are working within the broad guidelines that HSAC has approved in terms of the buckets of things that they would like to see advanced. That task force was charged by all the elected bodies with thinking about kind of short/immediate things that could be done, midterm and long-term. And so that group is continuing to meet. My understanding is that task force will continue to meet through May. One of the conversations in that subcommittee has been that any work that gets advanced would be like, let's just say that any of the immediate term pilots or things that get launched, which would be consistent with all the things that have been discussed in this group. If that happens, the reporting body back, the body that would be hearing about how that work is going, would be HSAC and policy and planning. So those are the kind of conversations that have happened. But again, they're also looking at, that group is looking at, in addition to the things that Drew mentioned, other things like day services and day shelter, which are part of HSAC's broader recommendation, with the question of anything that could happen, putting forward options for things that could happen prior to the end of this fiscal year for consideration by elected bodies. And Eliza Matthew is chairing that subcommittee for the task force. We're happy to answer any additional questions.
Rita? She dropped her appointment. Any questions, comments?
Can you hear me, Colin?
Yes, ma'am, I can.
Okay, the one question I had was in reference to how it was communicated, the shift, because I was a part of that ad hoc, the original committee, Drew and Ryan, how it was communicated so that we could participate with the other group, since that was not gonna function, because I was a part of those two meetings.
Drew, Ryan, that was a question for you guys. How did you let the rest of your committee know that the committee was pausing its work to go work on the larger committee? Because it sounds like Colleen got left out of the loop.
And that's possible. And if so, I'm happy to take responsibility on behalf of that. I will say that when I think about the work of the ad hoc committee, I think a lot of that work was shaping initial conversations that we had in policy and planning that ended up with policy and planning moving forward and prioritizing a number of recommendations that included pallet, shelter. All that work was, for me, was a culmination point of the work that we did over that month or two of intensive meetings where we were reviewing multiple proposals. That work shaped what would be policy and planning's recommendation to HSAC, what HSAC's recommendation for funding priorities. The committee picks up in some ways in a very different place of they have a charge of thinking about short-term, immediate-term options and pick up in a way that is both connected, but I think just separate from. So I hear what you're saying, and I'm happy to take accountability for not making sure that everyone in that group got emails out, but I also see them as distinct and separate from. And we're happy to pull other people back into that work who are interested, who haven't been part of those meetings, which have largely occurred over the last few weeks over the holidays.
And I would just add as well as I'm unclear, like as distinct groups, Ryan and I were co-chairing the ad hoc group, and I don't understand who's invited to the pre-shelter task group as well. Like that, we don't chair that committee as well. So,
Right.
And
It sounded like the ad hoc committee paused its work to join the other committee's work, where many people were on that other subcommittee. And it was a communication breakdown that we just need to clean up and determine whether or not the ad hoc committee is going to continue its work at some point, or if the ad hoc committee is sort of on hiatus until this other committee work is completed.
And I would just say that we're receptive to what this group decides. Like, I'm happy to reconvene that group as a co-chair of that committee. If there are members that say, yes, let's move that forward, I'm happy to do so.
Or if the two, or what I'm also hearing is if the other committee is sort of duplicating the work, making sure that folks who are on the original committee, as Ryan was saying, are invited to the subcommittee work group as well, which may make more sense, where I think it would be good to, it's just cleaning up the communication gap and making sure folks who are part of that original committee have the opportunity to be part of that overarching committee as well.
So I'm back, so, because I have some questions. So so are we dissolving? And I've been hearing bits and pieces of the doctor came in a really bad moment in the conversation, which is why I couldn't respond. Are we discontinuing the ad hoc committee because the work is going to be done in this other group? That's one question. And number two is, does that other group have any obligations to report anything back to policy and planning? Because my understanding was that there was a different avenue for those for that work to be done, different process from us.
So I'll take that, and Ryan, step in and correct me if you, or feel free to add anything. I don't think we're discontinuing the ad hoc working group from this policy and planning committee. And I think anything that comes out of the pre-shelter working group, which will conclude in May, needs to come back once it concludes and be accountable to policy and planning, if that makes sense.
I'm just wondering if there are conflicts of interest between the ask of HSAC and this other group. This is why I'm asking the question. Because I know there are certain things that we laid out in the funding request that HSAC is making to city and county leadership. For example, things like not particularly assigning funds to any entity, having a competitive RFP process so that other people or providers who are interested in working on, homelessness and a resolution to homelessness in Durham County have the same opportunity to take advantage of an open process. I don't know what the ad hoc process is right now, so I would just be concerned if there's a conflict specifically around that, because I've heard, and I can't speak for anybody else, that there have been concerns from the community about who always gets funds and who gets left out of the opportunity to serve. So I just think that we need to be mindful of that. Does anybody have any questions? I thank you guys for the work. I'm excited to see what comes out of ad hoc, and I think of the pre-shelter group, and if we can get it funded to further help our neighbors who are outside freezing right now, literally today, it would be great. No questions? Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Ryan. The next item on our agenda is the tent distribution policy, Colin. And this is scheduled to take up a significant portion of our meeting. We got a lot of information via email on Friday as it relates to this and our encampment policy. So I'm hoping we can have a lively discussion about this. Embrace at least the preliminary process, policy, and go from there or perfect it. All right, Colin.
So as you know, there was a request to have a tent distribution policy come from the HSAC on what to do. So the homeless team did some research and looked at how to possibly roll out a tent distribution policy, knowing that we have an encampment response policy that gets triggered anytime an encampment, which is defined as one person, one tent, one sleeping bag, anything could trigger the encampment response policy. And also knowing that encampments and folks who are unsheltered out in the community also trigger calls to 911, they trigger calls to Durham One Call, and oftentimes to other departments, and trying to balance the variety of needs of making sure our folks experiencing unsheltered homelessness have some temporary structure to protect them from the elements, and also ensuring that there is a path to help those folks exit to permanent housing, as that's our goal in the homeless system, is to create a path to permanent housing for those who are interested in it. So the policy sort of lays out two ways, and your gold standard of a tent distribution policy, if you would, is a sanctioned area that is set up, it's safe, it's secure, it has toilet facilities, could be porta-johns or other type of thing access to trash service, supportive services, etc. In the absence of that, we thought, okay, if we don't have here is where tents can be used, in an effort for tents to be distributed, there would need to be some sort of a reasonable ratio to ensure that folks who are given tents are also receiving appropriate supportive services to help them navigate the system, help them move through the system to permanent housing, and then be able to sort of label tents in a way that the community would be able to clearly know and articulate that, oh, this person is connected to a service provider. If a neighbor had a complaint, they would be able to call that service provider. Or if complaints came into the city manager's office, Durham One call, 911, or anywhere else, folks would be able to figure out, is this a tent with a label? Is this an unlabeled tent? So we could also use our unsheltered coordinating agency resources wisely. So it would be sort of trying to use the tents as part of a street outreach and or temporary emergency shelter type program, if you will. So that's kind of where we came from with the draft that we sent out, and looking for feedback on it so that we can work through the next iteration to bring back and work it through the HSAC for adoption. So with that, I will turn it back to you because we do have to juggle all the variety of needs of the encampment response policy, the written standards, and sort of as a homeless system, the goal is either move folks to permanent housing with supportive services. The other option is obviously we could also take everybody who needs a tent can be protected with or without supportive services. And there's pros and cons to all of these. So I will open it up for you all to discuss and provide feedback as you see fit.
Just a starting question, maybe to help us get some background, because I've read through this. It's interestingly dated October, so this apparently has existed for 90 days. My sense has been that we're having a conversation that's essentially a debate between two city departments in terms of how these are to be. And I'm glad Ryan's coming on because it's probably something you two need to address. Has this been, I mean, obviously this has been out there for 90 days. Can you talk to us a little about, has there been a reconciliation process between two policies? Is this just one version of the policy? Or just one of the policies, so we kind of know. I mean, I think most of us are fairly aware this has been a debated thing and for a while now, and certainly came out that way during work session, which has obviously prompted this to come to us today. So how have we gotten to this policy? What have the conversations been so that we have a sense of what the intent is between the two departments discussing this?
So this is the policy that was drafted by the homeless team. Homeless team and community safety have met and had some discussions about it. There's two different lenses that are being applied. So one lens is the sort of emergency room response, from an emergency response, protect everybody from the elements. And the other is from the homeless system, part of an overarching homeless strategy. So we have talked, we've met, we've discussed it, and looking for feedback from the group to continue the discussions and making sure that we get viewpoints from all of the stakeholders involved. This is not a end-all be-all. I just sent out the unedited version of just sort of a blank slate to sort of solicit feedback as best we could without putting forth a whole lot. So go ahead, Ryan, if you want to chime in. Can't hear you, Ryan.
While we're waiting on Ryan, I will also say in light of our was it our December meeting when we had the public comment response around our tent policy, whether we had one or not. Um, uh, as a response to that, because we do want to respond when our community comes to us. And I think I also, stated at HSAC, like we were gonna like have this conversation, but I would just like to also add, like, Colin and I did go back and have a conversation because like we knew about this issue for several months prior, probably back to that October date. And, I was just saying to, in our conversations, my conversations with Colin and how we respond when our community validly comes to us and says like, we need this thing and we don't understand why we don't have it, that it was beyond time, like a lot of time had passed since we identified this need. And in us as a governing body or advising body responding. And so I did stress to him that we needed to push forward whatever it was that we already had on the table, whatever draft we had in working format, because we needed to have a response instead of just no response. We're in the toughest months of the year. We see our numbers are increasing. We don't want anybody freezing to death. People don't know what to do. I've had conversations with different providers just trying to understand what they do and the services they provide around those things, especially when I'm encountering unsheltered people in my clinic. And I just, I just kind of stressed to him, like, we need to, whatever policy is that's being worked on behind the scenes, it needs to be brought to the body so that we can discuss it. We can come up with something. In the meantime, it might not be the final plan, but we need to have a plan. We need to have a response. And personally, I felt like we took too long to even get this draft to the body.
And just to clarify, Shrita, is everyone aware that the manager has provided interim guidance? So there is an operating plan currently until such time as a full plan's in place. I'm just asking that for people's awareness.
No, I have not shared
in
that.
terms of how fast we need to move.
No, that was gonna be the next piece is the interim plan.
Ryan, did you want to go ahead and share, or do we want Colin to talk about the interim plan now?
Drew has his hand raised.
Drew?
I'm happy to wait for Ryan and Colin if whatever is appropriate.
I can
Can y'all hear me now?
yes, now we can.
Okay, I apologize. All right, so Russ, let me respond first to your question. So Colin did invite us for a conversation this past Friday, so we met to share our thoughts on the policy. I would say, Russ, to your question, this policy does not represent a, say, reconcile policy, to use your words, which is both departments being in agreement. We did share some feedback and some points of concern. I think community development's preference in the space, which I understand is wanting to hear from this group. If the group is interested in our thoughts, I'm happy to share them. We did share some concerns we had with the policy in that meeting that aren't reflected in the current draft that you see. And then I'm happy to speak to the interim guidance that my department received from Deputy City Manager Ferguson. Sorry, Deputy Manager Ferguson's old habits die hard. So when Manager Ferguson became manager on January 1st, shortly thereafter, he provided interim guidance to my department. That guidance was really two parts. So we had in our inventory at that time 53 tents remaining that we had not been able to give out under the kind of suspension of that while we were waiting on a policy. We were authorized to give a portion of our tents to Housing for New Hope so that Street Outreach could distribute them at their discretion. And then for the remaining portion of tents that we have in our inventory, so we transferred 20 tents to Housing for New Hope Street Outreach Team after talking to Russ, and I appreciate that, Russ. For the remaining 33 tents, we're able to give out tents when 2 conditions are met. The conditions are white flag night has been called and that all emergency shelters are full. If those 2 conditions are met, then our team is authorized to pass out tents. So that is the interim guidance that we are operating under until a policy is put in place that would supersede that. So, and I'm happy to answer any additional questions if people have more about our particular concerns or questions about the proposal, but that's as direct as I'll just pause now.
Go ahead, Drew.
Any questions?
Sure, I'll go ahead. Thank you both. I think my question, or I guess just comment, and watching the work session from late December is, it seems to me like elected leaders really looked at HSAC to take the lead for how to address policy around homeless services. And there seems to be a bigger question of what is the role of tents in addressing and serving our homeless neighbors. And I appreciate all the work that goes into the policies. And I guess my question for this group and for individuals on this call this morning would be, what is the role of tents? And that's a bigger question. I think there's a spectrum, and I think that's a conversation worth having because, and that really needs to go, I would hope beyond policy and planning, and maybe we can make recommendations, but to the larger HSAC as well, of what does that mean in Durham and what is that larger piece for capacity within our system, and what does that look like? So yeah, I would just open that up to the group is like, let's just have, I think there's pros and cons, and there's, certainly, yeah, like just having a good, honest conversation about like the needs and how we see that fitting in our community. So I would just open that up.
I think that's a great encapsulation, Drew. And I think that's where, when this first came up, and Drew and I had a conversation on this almost a year ago, when we realized it was happening, because generally speaking, we have not, as a system, passed out tents, partially because of things like the state guidance for those of us that were operating under state ESG is you can't be reimbursed for this, you can't do it. Which is why I brought it, as a question to Ryan and leadership last March. So I do think that I think Drew's encapsulation is a good one, because what is the role of tents is a really good question, because there's all kinds of different guidance. It has shifted over the last 4 or 5 years, I think, probably because of the crisis. But I find this to be a very well-written policy, but I read it as don't distribute tents. And I appreciated the interim guidance from the city manager, because I felt like it did put some bounds on, because I am neither, and I will say this on behalf of H&H, we are neither, let's be like Oprah and you get a tent, you get a tent, you get a tent, you get a tent. And we're also not like no tents. But I feel like when I read through the policy, the piece that made me kind of pause was the marking of tents piece. Like, just on a practical level, unless we're passing out cotton tents that they use for like Civil War reenactments or glamping, 2 extremes, there's not a good way to mark tents. We'd almost need to put those Apple trackers on to figure out where these tents are going in case somebody abandons it and it goes to someone else. So like I said, it's very well written. Don't mishear that. But when I read it, what I feel like I'm reading is don't do this. And it does feel like there needs to be a conversation around what the role of tents is in the system. And then have a policy written from whatever that settled place is. And I don't think it's either end of kind of where I feel like we've been caught between departments.
Thank you, Russ. Abena said ESG funds can be used for tent purchasing. The issue is the state that administers the state ESG money has said their ESG funds, the state has put a rule in that you cannot use that portion of ESG funds to purchase tents. That's a state rule that said that you can't do it. HUD is much more nuanced and says, yes, you can do it with that. So the city as an entitlement jurisdiction gets ESG funds. The ESG funds that come to the city are currently being used for rapid rehousing. However, if the entitlement ESG funds that came to the city were to be reallocated to a street outreach program instead of rapid rehousing, tents are an eligible expense per HUD, per the AAQ that was attached in there. That we did send an AAQ to HUD to get their take on it, and their take sort of goes back to, how and it needs to make sure it's a temporary structure, not a permanent housing solution. And they offered some suggestion and guidance to be able to do it and make it part of an overarching strategy. Just want to answer that question.
So I kind of agree with Russ as far as kind of what the policy, what it feels like, because it kind of puts us. We already know that we have a capacity issue, right? So I feel like the policy that exists right now is like the ideal way in which we would want tents to be used in our community. The reality of our situation is that we have tons of people who are unhoused, whom we cannot serve. And so the question then becomes, because we can't serve them, does that mean that they can't be protected outside? So I would love for a tent distribution policy to be a temporary issue, but we don't even have affordable housing. We can't even move the people out of rapid rehousing and PSH that we have on the list that we're trying to place right now. So I think if under different circumstances, the policy as is written would be great. But in the current reality of our situation, that having it that organized and that temporary in the ideal sense is not realistic.
Sharita, I want to second what you just shared. I absolutely agree. And those are some of my thoughts on this tent policy. Personally, I look at tents as a human, filling a human need, whether it is looking at it from the homeless service perspective or emergency room perspective. If we don't have housing, let alone true affordable housing for people, then we need options. And sometimes those options may be tents. And the way the policy is currently written, one, Russ, I agree with you from a financial standpoint, it's not really realistic to mark tents for nonprofit agencies or city entities with limited funds. That's not realistic. And one of the things in the tent is saying for sanctioned encampments for spaces. Right now, we have no spaces in this city or county that are sanctioned. And so, Sharita, I agree. I think maybe ideally this policy covers a lot, but right now is blocking us as an entity, people who truly want to serve our neighbors, from being able to serve our neighbors in the most generous opportunities and possibilities because of some of the language that is in this policy.
I absolutely, I absolutely agree with you. I think in one of the conversations Colin and I had offline, I literally said that, like, I'm like, okay, we don't have any sanctioned place, but I've known for street outreach to say, okay, if a person's been told they need to move from a certain place, they will help them move to another place that they can pitch their tent. And so my thing is like, so there are other places that our street outreach can take people. Why can't we make some space, some room in our community to say you can at least tent here? I feel like it would um, give people a place where they don't have to worry about somebody coming to their stuff. B, it would minimize the number of encampments we have spread out and how far street outreach has to run in order to, get to people. And two, it helps with continuity of services and being to help people get other things they need that may put them on a path to getting housing quicker. So I almost feel like we do need to pick some places where it's okay for people to be. I think the tent policy that's been presented is the gold standard tent policy, but we're not living in a gold standard community, So we need to do, we need to come up with something else that's more realistic and more humane for the people that are outside and not protected from the elements in any way, shape, or form.
But to go back to what Drew was saying and that I was trying to amplify, we need to have a conversation about the role of tents, because I will say I disagree with the notion that there's no housing solutions. We continue to wait for community development to provide us information on the units and when they're coming available. And I mean, even some of these interim solution discussions are for like 10, 12, 5, whatever, small clusters of an encampment, when it appears some of those, like, housing is coming along, that's a possibility. We just need to know more of that. So again, I'm not either or, but I feel like part of the missing information is what is really going on around some of the housing. And then I feel like we need to at least dive a little bit into some of the thinking from other communities around this, because I am concerned. I mean, one of the things the street outreach team members told me was we never really got questions for tents previously. Once tents were being handed out, it kind of created a market expectation that those might be available. It's not unlike what we experienced as a system around the hotels during COVID. And that's not entirely bad, but I think it's just something we have to be realistic. At times we do kind of create a market expectation that these pieces may be available. So it's not coming out of need, but preference potentially. And some of the guidance from other communities previously has been that tents cause people to wait longer to go into housing, or more people take advantage of that. And we do know we've had people exit Williams Square in Andover because they didn't want to have to pay anything. And they felt like if there was a solution such as, I know that's an unpopular statement to make, but we've had people tell us that, that we're making that exit. And so sometimes to save that $200 a month, people may make that choice. And so again, that question of the role of tents overall relative to, congregate and non-congregate shelter, and then quicker paths to housing is important before the policy is figured out.
Looks like Chris has his hand.
I'll go ahead if that's all right.
Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Sarita. Yeah, I can't. My name's Chris Noblett. I'm a North Carolina organizer for the National Union of the Homeless. I can't speak to this draft policy because I haven't seen it, haven't been given it. And I just wanted to say real quick that I'm glad there's an interim guidance on giving out the tents. But frankly, it falls pretty short of any real need. You might as well give the tents to the mortuary. To be frank, like hypothermia can happen above 50 degrees. Just waiting for cold nights, until 7:30 when white flag shelters open is too little too late. And that's what I just want to say about that. But also just want to touch in this discussion to this dichotomy going on, this talk between the emergency room and the strategy of the community of care. I think that's a false dichotomy, really. I mean, homelessness is skyrocketing across the country right now. And this community of care model is this is what HUD has structured the strategy to end homelessness, and it is failing. Waiting until people are homeless and then putting them through these homeless services hasn't been working. And I personally, I think that's just because the shift from public housing to these shelters and services is to blame. Like literally, funding has been taken from the public housing and was given to FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, to set up these shelters in the first place. So just putting that into the perspective of like, actually, these shelters and services are an emergency room response already. So, I mean, I hope that there can be a policy. We personally, the union is in favor of sanctioned encampments, and we hope that something can come out of that. But we should think that we think that y'all should totally allow any entity such as community development to hand out tents if it can help get around these arbitrary state rules that are preventing the COC from distributing them, because we know that the state has a lot of those kinds of rules in place for people to live. But that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris.
There are a few questions in the chat. Do we still have landlord engagement?
Yes, we still have a landlord engagement program. And Housing for New Hope manages that contract or has that contract. And
So
then
is landlord engagement they are not privy at all to any of the housing coming online, like independent of community development?
So to answer your question, this is the question I've been asking since September 23, is for us to all have access to the information about projects where the money from Forever Home Durham has gone into them and there's set-asides, where there are set-asides. So what we were last presented was information on generalized information on projects and the total number of units, but not clarity on how many units at each level, rent levels, rent amounts that are anticipated, and when projects would come online. That information is different than the landlord engagement process, because we need that information as a system. For example, if we have a family with, that needs a 3-bedroom unit, and we can put them into rapid rehousing into something that's costing $1,800 a month now, but we know that that's not sustainable. We can go in with the expectation that, project A is going to open and rent would be $700 for a 3-bedroom unit, and that is sustainable, and we can use rapid rehousing as a true bridge to sustainable options. So we're in a position of still waiting to hear more of what's coming. And that's like, it's public information if one of us does a FOIA request. I have felt like we shouldn't have to do that. But that is separate from landlord engagement.
In terms of Hardy Street and Cedar Trace, meetings, community development is having meetings with both of those property management firms this week and next week to iron out the process and timelines. To answer Sally's question that came up in the chat. So what I'm hearing from the group is go back, remove labeling of tents. What else does the group want to remove from the tent policy or keep in the tent policy? Is it distribute tents to anybody who wants and needs one with or without supportive services? When we do that, it does trigger a lot of the unsheltered coordinating agency doing a lot of spending their time dealing with complaints. We met this morning and are currently working through 13 new encampments and one or two that have kind of been around and keep popping up. One of which is going to need to be taken down due to health and safety issues. So some of this goes back to how do tents fit in our spectrum? Are they a 911 life-saving piece and we're not worried about the supportive services and the time to, and then who is responsible for supporting folks in those, or they just go. And you're right, we wrote the policy in an ideal saying this would be the ideal way to do tents. And if we want to do tents, we should aim for what the ideal was. That's where the homeless team was coming from, was sort of doing that sanctioned encampment and allocating resources to make sure that we adequately could provide for those intents, knowing that, you know, if we spend a dollar on this side of the ledger, we got to spend about $2 on this side of the ledger to support people on the permanent side. So it's trying to find that healthy balance in the system. And, you know, like I said, we're looking for feedback on what changes the group would like to see in the next iteration of this. And I'm hearing remove the labeling. What other items would folks like to change specifically? Or are there things that anybody would like to keep in the policy or feel as an important piece of holding on to?
I do apologize, you guys. I actually lost my daughter in the hospital, so I had to hang up. There is a statement in the chat. And I can't see it. So Colin, can you read it? It's from Mary Molina.
Yeah, I saw that. The vacant buildings that could be used as temporary facilities for unsheltered folks. I don't know which vacant buildings they are off the top of my head. The general rule of thumb is if a building's vacant, it's vacant for a reason. So they might not be necessarily habitable. I know the Boys and Girls Club that folks have talked about using over on Pettigrew has hundreds of thousands, if not $1 million worth of asbestos, lead paint, and HVAC and structural issues that need to be done. I don't know dollar amounts for them, but I do know there's a lot of work to be able to use that facility. A lot of buildings that are older and vacant may have had a lot of things. Northern High School, the gym there could potentially be used, and we have talked to them about using the gym for White Flag. The challenge with Northern High School is the distance and staffing and how to pay for it. So in an ideal world, we would essentially have a larger White Flag and make White Flag a year-round option to expand shelter capacity, which would take away the need for tents. If funding and stuff was available, you would have a larger emergency shelter system. And then that would negate the need for tents because you would have a place for people to go on any given night without any, sort of like a sort of run it the way we do White Flag. But we're not there yet. And I don't even know if we'd have a provider that would be able to do that year round, even if we had a location.
Colin, could you chat or put into the link, the policy? I just don't know how many people on the call have had a chance. I know you sent it out, but I don't know if having it more readily available would help people answer your question, because it seems like some of the concerns we've heard wouldn't be just removing that one thing wouldn't address some of the concerns that I've heard, but or wouldn't be enough to address them.
Sure. The policy gets sent to the committee members, so that's
okay.
That's why everybody on the call doesn't have it. It got sent to.
Understand.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was having some connectivity issues there for a second. I would just say that I do feel like tents have some role within our system. I feel like I like to think of things existing on a spectrum between, like enforcement and compassion, and that we can't have one without the other. And so, just handing out tents without any supportive services, like that just seems like there's no framework around where they're going to go, who's going to follow up with folks. That doesn't seem like a long-term sustainable solution for homeless services in Durham. On the other end of that spectrum would be like just enforcement, and that would be, no tents whatsoever because we find them to be unsightly, and that seems really inhumane to me. And so I think at least having this honest conversation about what is the role of tents, I do think having a sanction place to say for folks who, and I think it's worth doing the work and continuing to revisit this conversation for what is the, what's the eligibility for entering a sanctioning camp? Like, is it just, do you have to meet what requirements, what eligibility standards, what's the length of stay? Like, it's worth having these conversations, but even if it's just as simple as having a tent policy, where do folks go? Like, this is, I think, a part of a broader conversation that I see, but I think that it's one worth having. Obviously, it's a part of a conversation that we have within the ad hoc alternative shelter groups, but again, like I just go back to that enforcement compassion piece, and I see that we have to have both. And to just hand out tents, but to have no place to go put them doesn't seem like a long-term solution for us either. And yeah, I'm happy to talk more about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm loath to suggest another meeting, but I almost feel like there needs to be some kind of, for lack of a better way to put it, independently facilitated conversation about the role of tents somehow. Because I still feel like the rest of us are kind of getting caught between two different approaches from two different city departments. And I understand that this is just part of working through having folks doing new things and folks doing stuff that have done it for a long time. And I mentioned that when I first brought this up in March. So I don't know what the possibility is for something like that to happen, and to be very thoughtful about representation in the conversation and pulling in some of this newer updated guidance. I mean, some of it just came out. So a lot of us haven't had a chance to look at it. Not the city guidance, but like federal guidance. Because I think it's worth the conversation about the role. I continue to be concerned that like we're going this way because we've lost the ability to have, I don't want to put it this way. Like Raleigh and Wake are standing up 2 new shelters like almost now and pushing out a lot of new pieces around PSH now. And we were in another conversation the other day where we were talking about a lot of the creative things that Alliance is partners of in other counties. And I can't figure out what we're doing wrong. And I'm going to say wrong this time, that like HSAC's not bringing those kind of pieces forward. I don't know if it's I mean, I have my questions about the governance design of this, of our group, if it's a leadership piece. Otherwise, it just feels like we're backing into a conversation about tents while the next door neighbors are like adding new shelters and like they're finding ways. So like why are we getting lost in a conversation about tents, which needs to happen? Don't misunderstand that, when others are going so much further.
I just want to say one final point. So, one, our department is, looking for and ready, to follow guidance from HSAC and from a collection of folks who are committed to the same work that we are. We're looking for that guidance on what our community's vision of the role of tents, what that is. I think we're having that conversation because it's not clear, and it's still from this conversation not clear to me that we have that, and I think it would be helpful. I hope everyone in this conversation understands that our department entirely endorses the kind of things you're saying, Russ, that we both want there to be more robust shelter options and more investment in permanent supportive housing and things that are addressing the real needs of neighbors who are unsheltered. We also recognize as first responders that we are looking to respond to the immediacy, the needs while we are doing that work, of folks who, with our shelters full or don't have other places to go, or may, by their choice, prefer to be outside, to try to reduce harm to them, to increase dignity and safety. And no one likes tents. I don't want tents to be an option. But it seems to me that while we are working on all the things that you've named, Russ, that we would love to see move forward and are fully supportive of, we're asking for this group on guidance on what does it mean to care for those who are, by choice or because they have no other option, choosing to sleep outdoors, and are interested in when and where we can provide tents. And if it's not tents, what else? Because there do need to be answers to that question. So I'm grateful for this conversation. I agree with you that I feel like there's more conversation to be had, and we would welcome an opportunity to participate in it. And I guess, sorry, one last thing I'll say is we are also, as others here, interested and supportive of the idea of a sanctioned encampment or encampments or pallet villages or other things that add to our shelter. I also think I think an ideal may not be only in sanctioned encampments. And I don't think the current policy reads that way, because the question will be, if someone where they're at right now and we're meeting them does not want to go into a sanctioned encampment or a shelter, and there's lots of reasons why that may be, I'm curious for the guidance of this group on what does it mean to reduce harm in that moment. And do we see the provision of a tent to someone outside of a sanctioned encampment is also something that this group would support, not as, so we also see this as like a full commitment to trying to make connections to supports. But sometimes, as you all know who do this work, that takes time, building rapport and building trust, and reducing harm in the meantime can be one strategy, effective way to build trust with a neighbor out there who might put them in a position where they are ready or wanting to engage more deeply in supportive services. So for me, these things are interconnected, but I do want to stress that we're looking for guidance from this group and prepared to get behind that guidance, and grateful for thoughtful conversations like this. So happy to participate further if there are other opportunities.
So what I'm hearing is a more focused conversation on a strategic plan on how tents are part of the overall homeless continuum. Is that what I'm hearing? I see Drew nodding. Others want to weigh in? Because we at the lead agency are trying to juggle a lot of different things. We're trying to juggle contracts. We're trying to juggle technical assistance, helping our providers get to where they need to be, making sure folks are in compliance, trying to pull together the coordination with the affordable housing piece and tents, and everything can't be a priority. We kind of like focus on permanent housing, focus on getting folks back to where they are. We're trying to meet everybody's wants and needs, and there's only 7 of us, and one of us is assigned to the housing opportunities for persons with AIDS. That's taken over tenant-based rental assistance as well. So there's only so much of us to go around, and we're happy to serve and provide whatever resources we can as we juggle through this and coordinate the system and the care. So happy to pull together another meeting to talk through or I can talk to the chair of this committee and see if we want to use February's meeting to talk about just the overall housing homeless strategy of the system and help to figure out where and how tents fit into the structure, which could then guide the policy.
If I may, Colin, I would like, in regards to this tent policy, tent distribution policy, to simply maybe have another meeting with everyone on this call, whether they are members or not, to discuss some of the barriers of this policy in order to provide humane and basic needs to our neighbors while working on a strategic plan or working on some type of sustainable long-term housing that you mentioned, Russ, that they are doing out in Wake County, that there is no doubt that Durham could do that. We have done so much more, and the possibilities are limitless. However, in the meantime, being able to provide tents as a basic need by restructuring and removing some of the language of this policy, and then moving forward to really implement a strategic plan or whatnot, I would suggest.
I support that, and I think, I mean, Colin, with what you've just described, I mean, it sounds like the team's pretty overwhelmed with everything that's on its plate, and Sharita's expressed something, and overwhelmed is fine. It's a lot.
It's
So
not
I think
necessarily-
if we could look to, there are plenty of community partners that like all they do all the live long day is facilitation here in Durham. I mean, I think it's like a facilitator every block, so, which is a gift. So maybe we could identify somebody who could facilitate the conversation so that all of us are coming in with information and not having to be the ones navigating a conversation, if that makes sense, or facilitating it. Just to take a little bit off.
Happy to bring in a facilitator to sort of work through this. And if this is, we can make this the priority. What I'm hearing is this needs to be the priority of the Policy and Planning Committee. Is that accurate, or is there something else that's higher priority?
I think our chair has dropped. I'm thinking she probably will be back soon. I would say this is the priority, and maybe not a long-term priority. I don't quite understand why it's taken several months to iron out this policy. And we're here now, so possibly another couple of weeks or, in next month, and we truly come together and look at it and create a policy that is humane and and feasible for all. And then move on to other needs in the community.
Thoughts?
Anise put a comment in the chat that he wonders if the meeting suggested by Russ and myself could be an ad hoc meeting that occurs outside of regularly scheduled meetings. That way policy and planning could continue with this other work as well.
Yeah, I mean, we can set up however the group would like to do that. I'm looking for what would the group like so that we as the homeless team can make it happen. And what I'm hearing is tents need to take priority. This policy needs to take the priority. We're putting other policy and planning work sort of not on hold, but it needs to take a back burner till we get the tents resolved. Is that accurate?
Can you remind us what's going to be put on the back burner at this time of year? I really am kind of at a loss. What
Well, we've got
focusing on?
Well, we've got contracts that we need to get done. We've got RFPs. We've got technical assistance for folks who are not performing up to par. We've got some of the reason we have a tent policy is because we've got some groups that are not meeting expectations, and we have gaps in the system that we've been trying to focus on getting some of these other things fixed. I also hear that we need to continue mapping out all of the permanent housing solutions. So if we're putting the permanent housing solutions secondary, that is almost done. That shouldn't impact it too much because I think that's almost done. There were 2 RFPs, and a lot of those RFPs, the housing question was only in the first one. So there's a lot of work that has to be done reaching out to developers from the second RFP to find out if they're going to be willing to work with the homeless system. So we can put that work. That's the piece where do you want the efforts going?
I mean, I feel like if we're bringing in an outside facilitator and I mean, we could even lean on Duke or Central to help us identify somebody.
Mhm.
Your team just needs to kind of show up the way the rest of us are going to show up in a sense. So there shouldn't be a lot of prep.
That's fine. Who's taking do you want us to take the lead on finding the facilitator? Or who's taking the lead on finding a facilitator?
I mean, I can think of 2 or 3 people that just love this stuff enough they might do it. That I'm serious that I would ask.
Okay, I
and,
can coordinate with you.
and run it by the chair and you and others. And if others have ideas, I just think a facilitated discussion that just kind of
Sure,
bust out the Post-its and figure it out.
we can do that. All right, so we will set up a follow-up meeting. Russ has some recommendations of folks that we can explore for facilitators, see who's available. Set up a second meeting outside of a policy and planning committee meeting to talk about the role of tents in the homeless system. And then once we have that sorted out, that should drive the policy. Does that sound accurate? Is that what I'm hearing? Not hearing anybody disagree, so I must have stated it correctly. All right, so we will work on getting that meeting scheduled and an outside facilitator to talk that through. And with that, I think we can close the tent discussion for today. And I'll give you a brief update, which I shared kind of a little bit earlier on the Forever Home Durham work. looking at the RFPs that went out. There were two RFPs. The first RFP had a question about working with special populations that included people who were experiencing homelessness in the COC. It was kind of a list of things, and it was a yes/no question, and it had about 3 groups. And then there was a narrative place where several organizations talked about specifically working with the COC. So we are in the process of going back and talking to the groups who put in their narrative about working with the COC to get things worked in place, or getting pieces put in place to have referrals from the COC go into those Forever Home Durham units, assuming they meet qualifications. I will share that CASA's Bryan Place, 10 units in that 16-unit building were filled from the continuum of care through the process. We're meeting with Hardy Street today, I believe, and we're meeting with Cedar, or wait, hold on. Meeting with Cedar Trace today about their units and a referral process. And we are also shooting, also working with Hardy Street next week after tax credit properties, after tax credit applications are due, to work through details of that. It's important to note the second RFP that went out was primarily funded by tax credits. Tax credits by rule must take a certain percentage of people from Target and Key. And that's administered through Health and Human Services at the state. And many of those folks are experiencing homelessness, and targeted key providers are able to get people into those units. So that's a place that there are people experiencing homelessness going into the units through the tax credit process, and through the tax credit homeless preference. Through that, some of those may or may not be part of the continuum of care, but it's not a continuum of care referral because we don't control that part of tax credits. Yes, Sally.
I had 2 questions. One is for the first RFP that went out and for referrals that can go through the COC. Do you have a sense of the timing of when units will become available and the costs, and whether there are sufficient subsidies and case management support already allocated that that the system will be able to fill those units? Because I mean, one of the things that happened with Casa Bryan Price is we did eventually fill them, but as you know, there was a lot of uncertainty about the actual cost, and the cost ended up being pretty high at a time when we didn't have vouchers in the system very much.
You are correct on that, Sally. There was a challenge, like CASA was working through their budgets, and their plan changed the way we had originally set it up. So this should give us a better idea I'll have a better idea after we meet with Cedar Trace, and after we do know the costs on Hardy Street and the number of units. Those are all tax credit properties. I don't know how many off the top of my head Cedar Trace has available. It's part of our meeting today, and we're working with Hardy Street next week.
Okay, I know that if a number of things come available at once and there's not capacity within the system, I don't know. I know Casa, for a variety of reasons, ended up sort of, slowly moving people in, but I just want to make sure we've got the capacity in the system to fill the units on the timeline that the property managers are looking for.
Yep, we'll definitely be able to do that, assuming we've got eligible folks, and there should be money out there. We've got people with money in their budgets, and we can always talk about partnering and subsidy layering and things like that if we need to.
Okay, and then the second question was, about those targeted units. I know you're looking at a possible RFP in the future around some flexible housing subsidies. I mean, the thing about the targeting units is they are really helpful for getting people in more quickly into housing, but you do have to be able to continue to provide case management. And I didn't know that that was something that a flexible housing subsidy pool would be able to address case management associated with targeted units or not.
Are you talking
May
about
not.
are you talking about the budget request to the city with that $700,000?
Yeah.
That would be for flexible housing vouchers and supportive services. So however that shook out, it wasn't a breakdown of it had to be used one way or another.
And I guess I just wasn't sure if there's any reason to prevent supportive services being used by homeless services providers to support somebody moving into a targeted unit.
If you had a voucher, if you had a voucher to pay for it, I don't know that there would be a reason off the top of my head to not use other funds to be able to do that.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
I'm sorry, guys. I don't know where you guys are. I lost my signal. But I'm back. Did we finish everything on the agenda?
We did. We wrapped up tents. We need a follow-up meeting and conversation to talk about how tents fit in the overall homeless system strategy. And from that, we'll develop the ongoing a policy for distributing the tents.
So did we want to go ahead and come up with that day and time now before we end this meeting?
We're going to use an outside facilitator to come help facilitate the conversation. That was the recommendation. So we got to coordinate with the outside facilitator to get their schedule and some options.
Understood.
So other than that, and I just gave a brief update on the affordable housing bond and sort of where we are on meeting with folks, Hardy Street and Cedar Trace, to get those worked out.
Okay, do we have any recommended timeline on how soon we're going to get together? Is it the plan for us to get together to discuss the tent policy prior to the next meeting?
It is a priority, but there wasn't a date. The hope is to get it done sooner than later. Whether or not it can be done in the next 3 or 4 weeks, I don't have an answer for that. I think it comes down to what's a facilitator's availability and what's the availability of folks who want to be involved in the discussion.
Does anybody have any suggestions of how we should go about coming up with that part? Should we go ahead and send out a doodle to get people's availability so that once Colin talks to the outside facilitator, we can go ahead, stop, baby. We can go ahead and match up dates?
Yeah, I guess just on behalf of the neighbors, I really feel like we should do this as soon as possible. And I know I don't even know if I'm counted as a member or not as part of HEART, but it's very cold right now. So I just want to, because I know Ryan said about the ED, the jail system. People are wanting to stay in jail because it is so cold outside. So I just want to say as soon as possible.
Okay.
To that extent, does there need to be some recommended change to a temperature, I guess you can distribute tents right now, right?
Yes, you can.
Mm-hmm.
That's my understanding.
Sorry, I'm just asking for that based on that last comment.
So we can distribute tents under white flag, and if our responders have confirmed that night all available space is full. So I think that last one has meant on some nights we have it. Now I think more recently, and Drew can step in, that the emergency shelter there has been full, but there have been white flag nights, just so everyone's clear, where emergency shelter is not full. And I think that in and of itself is a good conversation for this group for another day. So that, I mean, there are some nights where there have been white flag where under the interim guidance, we are not able to. Now, Street Outreach could, because Street Outreach has full discretion over when it does not have to operate under the same guidance as our department. So to answer the question directly, once we run out of tents, we are not authorized to order any more at this time. So those are the stated parameters of the guidance so that everyone's clear.
And just to add on, to what Ryan said, to bring further clarity, Sharita, if it is 35 degrees outside, if it's 40 degrees outside and it's cold, community safety cannot distribute tents because it's not white flag. So yes and no, because it gets cold outside at 40 degrees and raining or just hot winds, and we cannot distribute tents.
Colin, does our white flag policy temp change when there's precipitation? Because for some reason I thought it did.
It does. It goes to 35 or 37 with precipitation.
37, I think.
Oh, it should be.
So 37 with precipitation and 32 without precipitation. But keep in mind, Open Table makes that call every week and tends to block it out for a week at a time. And the announcement just came out for this week while we were in the meeting. Hold on a second. Drew, is Drew still on?
Yeah, I'm here. We're tentatively, it looks like Friday will be a little warmer, so and we can adjust it within 48 hours too, but every night this week. Looks like Friday might be, yeah.
So
and just so we're all clear, that's based on AccuWeather as our shared forecast.
But there's also precipitation planned for Friday, Saturday.
The white flag is
Sunday.
Right. So white flag is open tonight, tomorrow, Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday. The only question is what's going to happen on Friday. So Yates Baptist will be open. That's what I'm reading. Is that correct, Drew?
Yeah.
So Open Table makes that call for the week on Monday based on the AccuWeather forecast. And we, as the lead agency, send that out to the community, to the COC listserv, to let folks know what's happening with the white flag. And then we also have the 4 additional rooms at Families Moving Forward that they historically have only had 1 or 2 of those 2 spaces utilized, and 10 beds for men and 5 beds for women at Urban Ministries. And they've maxed those out once or twice per Sheldon. For the most part, they only have about 2 or 3 women and 6 to 8 men taking advantage of that overflow. And Drew, I think Thursday, Friday of last week was the first time Yates Baptist was at full capacity.
Yeah, and I think it's tough too, because I'll just say about this iteration of white flag, it's getting the word out. It's in a different location, but been at capacity or closer to capacity since about Thursday of last week.
Russ, does that answer your question about tents and white flag?
I think so.
I still just want to go back to try to see that I do want us to respond to this tent policy. I do want us to develop this tent policy to a level that I think we can be comfortable with as a community. I feel like we really do need to set a priority, or we'll be in February. If we don't, for how soon we can meet. I don't know what everybody else's availability is. I will try to make myself available in the afternoons if that is what the wish of the group is. But I do think that we need to identify days and times in advance of a facilitator being talked to, so that we can go ahead and expediently get a date for a follow-up meeting. Is it possible that we can get a doodle poll sent out
I'm gonna
to all
contact
interested parties?
Sharita. I'd agreed to contact some potential facilitators. I'm already chatting with one, so I think as soon as we can get dates from that person, we can get dates out for folks and see what.
Hello, I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Angela. Been trying to click on, but I couldn't. Who calls the white flag for urban ministries? Because there have been times where they were not doing it and we sent someone. So you say
They,
Open Table Ministry calls it the other times.
no, they should be following the same guidelines that we're following on the system. I'll talk to Sheldon and find out. If you can send me an email, Angela, if you know date and time, so I can kind of go back and try and look at it. And most of their overflow comes through Open Table. We try and fill Yates Baptist first as best we can, and then use Urban Ministries and FMF as the overflow when possible.
Okay.
Colin,
All right. I'll speak with
Or direct people as needed to the appropriate.
I'll speak to Nicole on that.
Yeah, Colin, this is Entry Point. This is Nicole Lamb. So with Jeffrey, how it's worked this season is there's 10 male beds at UMD, 4 female beds at UMD, and 4 families. And Monday through Friday, when it is White Flag, Entry Point is sending the referrals to them. They are not doing it on the weekends. So with weekends, they're saying they're using it because we're not sending referrals on the weekends. What they say on the weekends, if it is below 32 and below, when they look at AccuWeather, it's for first responders and the heart team and the police, basically.
Okay.
Colin, I do know of one date. It was a date that UMD were doing their Christmas party.
Okay.
All right, gotta go.
Okay, thanks. All right. So I'm hearing we need to get a doodle poll out, and we'll coordinate with Russ on facilitators, and we'll go from there.
Okay, sounds like we have a plan. Is everybody good with that plan?
All right. Thanks all.
So it's 12:03. We have reached the end of our meeting. I don't know if I need to get a motion to adjourn.
I think
and just look out for communication about. Thank you. And we'll be looking out for a response from you, Russ, and then a subsequent response from community development about times. Is that how that's gonna work?
Yes, we'll coordinate that.
Okay. All take care.
Thanks all. Have a good one.